Okay, here we are today for our lecture, and I am going to be talking today out of chapters 6 through 9 of the book by Os Guinness. And I have to give a little bit of a caveat at the beginning. I'm working at home alone today, and my wife is not here, and so we have this. Yeah, doesn't she look pathetic? Her name is Demi, and she's a Malchi. Say hi. Say hi, Demi. Hi to everybody. Well, the only way I could get her to be quiet is to set her on my lap. And so that's where she is. And so if you hear an occasional little whimper, that's not me. That's Demi. But nonetheless, we'll go on from there. I think I can handle it if you can. In these chapters, chapters 6 through 9 of the book by Guinness, we have a kind of a common theme that's going on. And the common theme is how we respond to people in creative kinds of ways. And even though each chapter has its own theme and title, all of them sort of gesture at that subject, which is in a sense what the whole book is about. But he gets into some real good stuff here. I think this is, in many ways, the heart of the book, and the last couple of chapters here that I've been working through again. As I think I may have mentioned, I read this book when I first bought it, about a year ago, but working through it as a series of materials for teaching on has been very rewarding for me. So he talks in chapter 6, for instance, about turning the tables, and starts with a a story from Chesterton. So, wow, it all kind of fits together, doesn't it? We've been reading Chesterton as well, a different book by Chesterton, who was famous, probably more famous for his fiction books than he was even for his works on philosophy and apologetics and ethics and so on. But goes to Chesterton and uses an example out of Chesterton's story that he's reciting here to talk about turning the tables on someone that you're having a conversation with. And in turning the tables, he also talks about triggering signals, and he's going to get into that in more detail a little bit later on. But here he talks about turning the tables. He says, for instance, that apologetics is in many ways pre-evangelism. And I think that's a good way of thinking about the way we normally think about apologetics. You know, we have talked in here before about the fact that apologetics can have a Christian audience as well as a non-Christian audience, in that a course in apologetics or a study in apologetics can encourage Christian people in their own faith. I've done some lecturing in churches on apologetics a number of times. Lecturing is maybe the sterile way to put it. I've done some teaching on apologetics. I've done it with young people, that is youth groups. Also done it with adults. I'm speaking to in January, speaking to a group of people, actually in a Sunday morning service in near Huntsville, Alabama. And of course, one of the big NASA research centers is in Huntsville, Alabama. They want me to talk about science and the Bible. And so I'm going to be a little bit out of my element since I don't have any kind of academic credentials in the area of science. But I've read a lot about science and the Bible, so I probably know more than those scientists do about science and theology. So hopefully I won't embarrass myself. But so we have that aspect of apologetics that is for Christian people. But when we think about it in the primary way that we have been dealing with it here in this course, it is a ministry to unbelievers. It's pre-evangelism. And so he has some good things to say about that. He wants us also to understand that we must never divorce the tasks of apologetics and evangelism. They can't stand on their own. And I think what he has in mind is something that we talked about earlier on, which is that apologetics is sometimes one apologist writing apologetics books for the sake of other apologists, that they'd have a conversation about apologetics. And he says, no, that's not really what this is all about. That happens. It's inevitable that that would happen when I have opportunities to meet with my fellow philosophers and apologetics professors at primarily Southern Baptist seminaries. It's Southern, where I taught for 15 years, and at Southeastern, where I'm doing some teaching today, not this day, but right now. It's always kind of encouraging to talk about apologetics, but that's not the primary goal in mind. It talks about how in this chapter, oftentimes people out there have a very childish understanding of the Christian faith, non-Christians do, and that we need to sort of bring them up to speed a little bit. And he has this wonderful quote on page 111 where he says, "As the early church boasted rightly, the message of Jesus is both simple enough for a child to paddle in and deep enough for an elephant to swim in." I think that's a kind of nice way of putting it. But he over and over again emphasizes that when we're dealing with non-believers, and particularly with non-believers who are skeptical about the Christian faith, but we have to come to them. We can't ask them to come to us. In other words, we have to speak to them on their own terms. If they're Marxists, then we need to know a little bit of Marxism. If they're Buddhists, we need to know a little Buddhism. Right down the street from us, in this very weekend that I'm recording this lecture, we have a Buddhist cultural center that's going to be having a retreat. So always interested. My wife is one of the night managers of a local motel, and she'll come home with some interesting stories about the Buddhists who are staying in the motel. But we need to come to the level of where these people are, and I think that this chapter really does point that out when he talks about turning the tables. He says there are two barriers that lie across our path at this point. One stems from the fact that every worldview, even the falsest or the silliest, is comprehensible on its own terms, and that's true. And then there's the other challenge that every conceivable argument either has been or will be put forward by someone, somewhere, sometime. So how do you decide between them? And his response to that is that we ask questions. We've encountered this before in this particular book by Guinness, and so we sort of come back to it again. Be a questioning kind of person. Turn the tables on them. When they ask you questions, ask them a question back again. He talks about prophetic subversion, that this was what the prophets did, that the prophets came to the people and probed them with questions. He talks about Elijah, for instance, who challenged Israel. Why are you halting between two opinions? If Yahweh is God, follow him. If Baal is God, follow him. Well, there's a probing question that's involved in all of that. Now, there's a lot of great stuff. We're covering a lot of material in this lecture today. So on to chapter 7, he talks about triggering the signals that we encounter. And there's several little turns of phrase that I think make this chapter very helpful pragmatically. He talks about the fact that there are such things as signals of transcendence. And what he's really talking about here is the fact that people come into a point in their life when they encounter a crisis. And that crisis points them to the fact that perhaps their worldview, even though they may have never used that term before, but the way they think about life, the way they've organized their thought life in relationship to their actual life, that there may be something wrong with that. And part of what Guinness is trying to say is that it's at those times that people are the most susceptible to a Christian witness. Now, we ought not to think in terms of, I want to get somebody vulnerable and susceptible. I hope their husband or wife will die, and then we'll have a conversation. That's not the point at all. But the fact is that those kinds of things happen. And we ought to be sensitive to people that we know in the circles of our life who are going through a time of intellectual and perhaps spiritual transition, and be ready to meet them at that level. In witnessing to people who are members of new religious movements, what we have traditionally known as cults in Christian experience, that's been my experience, that if you're dealing with Jehovah's Witness people, they're pretty entrenched in their faith, but they don't really understand the grace of God. And so when some difficulty comes into their life and they need a word about grace, you can be there for them. I've seen Jehovah's Witnesses come to Christ in moments like that, and read many stories about that as well. He uses a number of different phrases here. He talks about people who have a hole torn in their life. And he talks about people who begin to seek. He says that sometimes they just come to the suburbs of Jerusalem, but it's our responsibility to help them get all the way into the city if we can do that. And so I think that this chapter on triggering the signals is a very helpful, practical chapter about how we deal with people and witness to people who are going through challenging times. He admits by the end of the chapter, not everybody's going to respond. And in the history of intellectual life, not everybody has responded. But sometimes, and he mentions the example of Kenneth Clark at the end of the chapter, whose work I have been familiar with for years. I have one of his big books as a coffee table book in my house, in fact, and have watched some of the video series that he has recorded. Kenneth Clark, as an octogenarian, came to know the Lord. Not very many people knew, but his priest knew, and his wife knew. And Kenneth Clark, the agnostic, came to the Lord through these times of transition. Chapter 8, Spring-Loaded Dynamics. This is a great chapter, especially in the way he deals with the David story in the book of 2 Samuel, chapters 11 and 12 and 13 and 14, for instance, and how Nathan the prophet was one who found that moment. He knew that David had sinned. Probably a lot of people in Jerusalem had suspected that David had sinned. The sort of what you get between the lines in the story is that nobody was talking about it, but Nathan would, and he told David the story, and aroused David's anger. And anger said that man should die, and Nathan said, "You are the man." Well, we may not have anything quite that dramatic happen in our witnessing situations. But the point is that we have to keep our audience in mind, and we have to keep the aim or the goal in mind. And the audience is the people who are part of our circle. And the aim or the goal is sharing the gospel with them and looking for opportunities to do that by getting to know them in their own personal lives. We're about out of time here, so I'm just going to say a brief word about chapter 9. And it's what he calls the art of always being right, but with a question mark. And there are people around who always need to be right. You know them. I know them. Maybe you are them. Maybe you have been them. I think at times I've probably been that way as well. But he gives me great examples of people who don't feel the need to be right, even though they are. And then they make a positive contribution into the lives of people as long as they're sensitive to the needs that they have. Well, I wish we had more time to cover this, but that's my introduction to these 3 chapters. We'll come back in the next lecture and talk about the remaining chapters of Guinness's book. Thanks.